Hello dear learners, welcome to SWAYAM NPTEL course on Methodology of Educational Research. I am Dr. Sarita Anand from Department of Education, Vinay Bhavan, Vishwabharati, Shantiniketan. And today we will talk about the module 16 on true and quasi-experimental research designs. This is lecture 16, and before going to the lecture we will go through the concepts covered. In earlier lectures we have covered the experimental research design, its process and types. Here in this process of experimental research design we had gone through the 10 steps process of experimental research design and types of experimental research design, especially the pre-experimental research design, and little bit we have seen the true and quasi-experimental research design. Now we will go in details about the true and quasi research design, and before that we will discuss about why experimental research design matter in education. Experimental research design occupy a privileged position in the educational research because they allow the researcher to establish the cause and effect relationship between the variables. When the researcher or the teacher educator ask, does this intervention really improve learning outcome? Experimental design provides the strongest answer. However, educational settings are messy. Human systems like school, classrooms, policies, the learners rarely allow perfect control. This is why the true experimental and quasi-experimental designs are existing as two complementary strategies rather than the rivals. Experimental research seeks to determine if a specific treatment influences an outcome. The researcher assesses this by providing a specific treatment to one group and withholding it from another, and then determining how both groups scores on an outcome. Experiments include true experiments with the random assignment of the subject treatment condition and the quasi-experiment that uses non-randomized assignment, said by Capel in 1991. Included within quasi-experiments are single subjects designs. So, let us start with the true experimental research design. What is its meaning and concept? The true experimental research design is a design in which the researcher manipulates the independent variable, randomly assigns the participants to group and controls extraneous variables to examine their effect on a dependent variable. Here in educational research, this design is often described as the gold standard for causal interference or inference because it minimizes bias and maximizes internal validity. According to Campbell and Stanley, true experiments are those in which random assignments provide a firm basis for causal interpretation. They mentioned it in 1963. In a true experiment, the equivalence of the experimental and control group is provided by random assignment of the subjects to experimental and control treatments. Although it is difficult to arrange a true experimental design, particularly in school classroom research, it is the strongest type of design and should be used whenever possible. 3 experimental designs are discussed in the following section, and I will discuss that, and characteristics of this true experimental design is like the 3 types, which are the true experimental research design, randomization and controlled group. So, in true experimental research design we can conduct it with the help of manipulation of independent variable, randomization and the control group. So, let us go by the one by one type of controlling, and with the help of this we can decide the characteristics of this true experimental design. Here in the manipulation of the independent variable, the researcher deliberately introduces an intervention like a new teaching strategy, AI based learning tool, assessment tool, flipped classroom, these kind of things can be used. And in randomization, the researcher can use the participants are randomly assigned to the experimental group and control group. This ensures the equivalence of groups at the outset. The third one is control group, and here a comparison group that does not receive the treatment or receives a traditional method without any one of these. The design cases or ceases to be a true experiment. So, the type of this experimental design is control group design, equivalent group design, and before going to the type, we can understand that the control group design is emphasizing the use of non-treated group of comparison, and equivalent group design emphasizing the initial equality of groups through randomization. So, mainly there are three types of true experimental designs. In the characteristics, we have seen about the manipulation, control and randomization. Here the true experimental research design is pre-test only design, post-test only design, pre-test post-test design, and the Solomon 4 group design. These three types of experimental research designs are you can study, you can go through in different research books, and we will start with the first one, that is post-test only design. The post-test only design or the only control group design is a is a powerful true experimental method where participants are randomly split into an experimental group and a control group. Experimental group gets the treatment and the control group no treatment, with the outcome measured only after the intervention to see if the treatment caused a change, effectively eliminating the pretest biases and allowing true causal inferences. So, there is no case of pretest here in this post-test only design. So, what is the structure? Experimental group has given the treatment and taken the post-test, and the control group no treatment or only taken the post-test. Or we can write in the research way, like we denote it RXO, and here this R and X and O represents the random assignment, X is the treatment and O is the post-test. And useful when the pre-testing may influence the learning outcome or the testing effect. That is why the if there is chances of effect of the previous knowledge or the experience, so avoid the pre-test post-test design and go for the post-test only design. Best and Kahn explains the post-test only control group design as below. They have designed or shown in their book that R into 0 1 and R C into 2. This X is the treatment group and this is no treatment, only control group. So, this design is one of the most effective in minimizing the threats to experimental validity. It differs from the static group comparison design in that experimental and control groups are equated by the random assignment. Now, we will talk about that the assumptions in the mean of the randomly assigned experimental and control groups from the same population will differ only to the extent that the random sample means from the same population will differ as a result of sampling error. What that mean? If the differences between the mean is too great to attribute a sampling error, the difference may attributed to the treatment variable effect. The researcher randomly selects the 80 students from a school population of 450 students, and the 80 students are randomly assigned to experimental and control groups or the treatments, and using 40 as the experimental group and 40 as the control group. The experimental group is taught concepts and congruence of the triangles suppose, and by an experimental procedure method X, and the control group is taught the same set of the concept by the usual method, or we can say the traditional method, and C, and here the time of the day and the treatment length in the time and other factors are equated or treated as the same, and then we can see that at the end of 3-week period, the experimental and control groups are administered a test, and the difference between the mean score is subjected to a test of statistical significance. The difference between the mean score is found to favor the experimental group, but not by an amount that is statistically significant. What does this mean? It means that the researcher rightly concludes that the superiority of the X group could be or could well have been the result of sampling error, and that there was no evidence of the superiority of the X method. So, if one on the other hand, the finding was that the difference between the mean was sufficient to the statistically significant, the researcher would have rejected the null hypothesis and stated that her research hypothesis was supported. The second one is pre-test post-test design. Here the pre-test post-test control design, also called as pre-test post-test randomized experimental design. It is a type of experiment where the participants are randomly assigned to either receive an intervention or not. The outcome of interest is measured 2 times, once before the treatment group gets the intervention and the pre-test, and once after it the post-test. The structure of this pre-test post-test design is the experiment group pre-test, treatment and post-test, and the control group is only having the pre-test, no treatment and post-test. So, this design allows the researcher to measure the change over time and attributes differences to the treatment. And pre-test post-test equivalent group design is also there, and Kahan, Best and Kahan has explained this pre-test post-test equivalent group design as below, and they have designed it like research group or the experimental groups. They are having the treatment, the second group is not having the treatment, and pre-test is taken, and after that post-test is taken, and the experimental group is getting the treatment and O2 is coming, and the equivalent group comparison group is getting no treatment, and O2 is also coming outcome as a outcome. So, here the R, capital R represent the random assignment, Q O1 is pre-test, X is the treatment, and O2 is the post-test. So, this design is similar to the previously described design, except that the pre-test are administered before the application of experimental or controlled treatments and post-test at the end of the treatment period. So, the only pre-test is the difference between the post-test only design and the pre-test post-test design. So, pre-test score can be used in analysis of covariance to statistically control for any difference between the groups at the beginning of the study. So, this is the strong design, but there may be possibility of the influence of interaction effect of testing with the experimental variable. So, Lanny in 1993 conducted a pre-test post-test true experiment to study the relative impact of 2 interventions on first graders' understanding of economic concepts. So, he randomly assigned 31 first grader students to 2 groups, both groups set up on the operating a market economy in their classroom, but one group received economic instructions referred to as debriefing, and after each market day, and the other group dictated a story about the experience, a placebo condition. So, the purpose of this study was to determine what misconceptions first graders students have about the economic concepts, and to determine if the debriefing sessions when added to the market experience were superior to the experience alone, as the theory being studied suggested that the results clearly indicated that the experience with instruction was superior to the experience only condition. So, in nutshell, pre-test post-test equivalent group design is a true experimental design in which 2 or more groups are made equivalent at the outset, usually through random assignment. Both groups are given a pre-test, only one group receives the treatment, both groups are given a post-test. The term equivalent group highlights the groups are statistically comparable before the treatment. So, what is the educational example of this kind of research design? We can take the example like two sections of the class 11th are randomly assigned, both groups take the science achievement pre-test, then experimental group uses AI module for 6 weeks, that is the treatment. The comparison group follows the traditional teaching and both groups takes the post test. This kind of study we can conduct since groups were made equivalent before the experiment. This is called pre-test post test equivalent group design. Now, the third type of experimental research is the Solomon 4 group design. This sophisticated design combines the previous two designs to control for the testing effect. Here the groups are the pre-test, treatment, post-test, pre-test, no treatment, post-test, and treatment, post-test, no treatment, post-test. It means it is combining both post-test and pre-test, post-test design. This design is powerful but logically demanding, hence less common in field based educational research. Here we in our PhD classes, our students feel difficulty to follow this kind of research design, the Solomon 4 group, which is including both post-test only and pre-test, post-test design. So, but we have to understand the concept of the Solomon 4 group design. Here in this design is also given by the all Best and Kahan, and in their book they have mentioned that the first one, the subjects are randomly assigned to 4 groups. 2 groups receive the experimental treatment, 1 experimental group receives a pre-test, 2 groups control do not receive treatment, and the fifth one is 1 control group receives a pre-test 03 and all groups 4 groups receive post-test 02, 4, 5 and 6. This design is really a combination of 2 groups of design previously described and the post-test only and the pre-test design. So, the Solomon 4 group design permits the evaluation of the effect of testing, history and maturation. So, analysis of variance is used to compare the 4 post-test scores. Analysis of covariance may be used to compare changes in 02, 04 because this design provides for 2 simultaneous experiments. The advantages of replication are incorporated, and a major difficulty is finding enough subjects to assign randomly to 4 equivalent groups. This is the practical difficulty in this research design. So, there are limitations to implement this design. Random assignment is often ethically or administratively impossible in a school. Artificial settings may reduce the ecological validity. Expensive and time intensive, not always feasible in natural classroom settings, and this leads researchers towards quasi-experimental alternatives. That is why you will, if you will go for the review study, you will find there is less studies with using this Solomon 4 group design. Now, we will go for the quasi-experimental research design, and what is the meaning and concept of this quasi-experimental? We had in previous lecture I had mentioned that this design provides the control of when and to whom the measurement is applied, but because random assignment to experimental and control treatment has not been applied, the equivalence of the group is not assured. Of the many quasi-experimental design, only 5 are described. See the Cook and Campbell book, and you can find that the comprehensive review of quasi-experimental design they have provided, and Campbell and Stanley 1966 again provided a table that quickly describes which threats to the internal and external validity of a study are controlled by each of the quasi-experimental design described, and Campbell and Stanley's table 2 also utilized for this lecture, and I have taken copied and pasted here that how they have described like the pre-test, post-test non-equivalent group design. And here in this design you can see that this often used in the classroom experiment when the experimental and the control groups are such naturally assembled through group in intact classes. which may be similar. As in the pre-test post-test equivalent group design, analysis of covariance may be used with the pre-test as the covariate, because this design may be the only feasible one, and the comparison is justifiable, but is in all quasi-experimental studies the result should be interpreted. So, in an experiment, two first grade classes in a school were selected for an experiment. One group was taught by the initial teaching alphabet approach to reading, and the other was taught by the traditional alphabet approach. Prior to the introduction of two reading methods and again at the end of the school year, both groups were administered and standardized reading test, and the mean gain scores of the two groups were compared. The IT group, initial treatment group, was shown as a significant superiority in the test scores over the conventional alphabet groups. And this initial teaching alphabet group, ITA group, is showing better performance, and however, without some evidence of the equivalence of the groups in intelligence, maturity, readiness and the other factors at the beginning of the experimental period, conclusion should be cautiously interpreted. So, we can see that the quasi-experimental research designs resembles as a true experiment, but lacks the random assignment of the participant to any group. So, the researcher still want to manipulate the independent variable, use comparison groups, employs the statistical control. So, quasi-experimental researchers acknowledge a practical truth of education. We study real classroom, not laboratory subjects. So, key feature include here in this quasi-experiment researcher design, that absence of randomization, use of intact or naturally formed groups like classes, schools or districts, the strong emphasis on design logic and statistical control, and the modern internal validity is used. So, major types of quasi-experimental designs are, there are mentioned here the 5 types of quasi-experimental design, that is natural experiment, regression discontinuity, interrupted time series design and non-equivalent group design. These are the 5 type of quasi-experimental design, and this visual is prepared with the help of napkin AI, and we will go one by one the type of quasi-experimental design. And the first one is non-equivalent control group design, and here the structure of the experiment will be the experimental group, pre-test, treatment, post-test, normal we have seen in the experimental researches, and the comparison group, pre-test, no treatment and the post-test. So, groups already exist, 2 sections of the classes. This is the most widely used quasi-experimental design in education. For example, comparing learning outcomes between the students taught using blended learning and those taught through conventional or traditional lectures. The second one is time series design. This repeated measurements are taken before and after the intervention. So, structure is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 treatment and the post test. So, pre-test, treatment, post test, and this design is powerful for studying policy changes, curriculum reforms or technology integration. The third one is interrupted time series design. Here an extension of time series begins with a clear intervention point. For example, evaluating the impact of the introduction of competency based assessment on a student's performance over multiple semesters, we can conduct the study of interrupted time series design. The fourth one is regression discontinuity design. This assigns the treatment based on a cutoff score on a pre-test, creating a sharp boundary for treatment effect like students above or below the test score. The fifth one is natural experiment. This influences the naturally occurring events like policy changes, disasters as the treatment, and studying the groups exposed versus unexposed. So, other key designs of this quasi-experimental research designs are the difference in differences. This is also well known design where compares the changes over the time between the treated group and a control group, effectively controlling for pre-existing trends. Matched pairs and propensity score matching, and it creates the comparable treatment and control groups by matching individuals based on the observed characteristics like propensity of scores. The next one is single group pretest posters design. This single group pretest posters design measures a single group before and after an intervention, lacking a control, but useful when controls are not feasible, not possible, then we can use this single group pretest posters design. Then the next one is cohort design. This cohort design is follows the cohorts that shares a common characteristics over time observing the outcome. So, now we will see through the limitations of this quasi experimental research design that they face threats to the internal validity due to the selection bias, the weaker causal claims that the comparison or compared to the true experiments, dependence on the statistical controls rather than the design control. So, true versus quasi experimental design, we can go for the comparison for the conceptual clarification. Here we can go through the aspects for the true experimental design and the quasi experimental design. I have prepared one table. If suppose you are interested for the randomization, then true experimental research design is mandatory and randomization is absent in the quasi experimental design. Control group, yes, in the true experimental as well as in quasi. Internal validity is high in true experimental design and moderate in the quasi experimental, and field feasibility low in the true experiment and the high in quasi experimental. Causal inference is strong in the true experimental and reasonable okay type of chances in quasi experimental. Educational use is limited in the true experimental researches, whereas the educational use is very extensively used in the quasi experimental researches. Now, we can conclude that the true and quasi experimental research designs together form the methodological backbone of causal inquiry in the educational research. They enable researchers to move beyond description and correlation toward a more rigorous understanding of what works, for whom and under what conditions in teaching learning process. So, the true experimental research design represents the highest standard of internal validity. Through random assignment, manipulation of the independent variable and the use of control or equivalent groups, they allow researchers to make strong causal claims with confidence. In educational research, through experiments are especially valuable for theory testing, validation of innovation or innovative pedagogies and controlled evaluation of instructional interventions. Whereas, a quasi experimental design on the other hand emerge as a pragmatic and context sensitive alternative. Although they lack random assignment, they retain the essential logic of experimentation by employing comparison groups, pretest post-test measures or time series data. Their greatest strength lies in the ecological validity. They allow researchers to study interventions in real schools, real classroom and real policy context. So, these both are important, both are useful, but quasi experimental research design is most prominently used in educational researches. So, in essence we can say that true and quasi experimental design should be viewed as complementary to each other rather than competing approaches. So, here are the few references which I have given for your further readings. I hope you will go through it and study regarding the further readings. Keep learning. Thank you.